It is the evening of June 6th, 1944. A group of German panzer grenadiers lies hidden in the tall grass of the Normandy dunes, staring at a colossal, unimaginable sight, the entire Allied invasion fleet. Popular history claims that German armor never reached the water on D-Day, yet these soldiers have just slipped through a glaring, unprotected gap between the British Sword and Canadian Juno Beaches. They are right at the edge of the English Channel, perfectly positioned to tear the fragile Allied beachhead in half. If they successfully pierced the front line and held the absolute power to shatter the invasion, what stopped them? This is one of the greatest and least understood paradoxes of the entire Normandy campaign. We are often taught that the Allied foothold was immediately impenetrable, secured by overwhelming naval artillery and relentless air supremacy. Yet, here is a genuine, glaring fracture in the Allied line. A mechanized German combat group has successfully navigated the chaos, driven a wedge straight down to the coastline at Lion-sur-Mer, and effectively isolated the British and Canadian landing forces from one another. The stakes at this exact moment are existential. A coordinated strike into the exposed flanks of Sword Beach could roll up the entire British position. The exits from the beaches are still choked with incoming landing craft, disorganized infantry, and soft-skinned vehicles trapped in massive traffic jams. It is the exact nightmare scenario Allied commanders feared most, an armored counterthrust hitting them before they can consolidate a continuous defensive line. So why does the hammer never fall? Why, instead of unleashing a devastating flanking assault to tear the invasion forces apart, do these advancing German troops eventually abandon the coast entirely? Why do they turn their backs on the sea and retreat inland just as a catastrophic Allied defeat seems physically possible? To unravel this mystery and understand how the German army threw away its best chance to win the Battle of Normandy on day one, we cannot just look at the dunes at sunset. We have to rewind the clock to the confused early hours of June 6th. We must view the unfolding disaster through the eyes of the 21st Panzer Division, the only major German armored formation positioned close enough to crush the invasion during its most fragile window of vulnerability. The 21st Panzer Division was not a phantom force drawn up on a situation map in Berlin. It was a fully mechanized, highly lethal reality. And on the morning of June 6th, it was sitting right on the Allies' doorstep. Stationed around Caen, barely a few miles inland from the Normandy coast, it was the only major German armored formation within immediate striking distance of the invasion beaches. While other panzer divisions were held hundreds of miles away in reserve, trapped by a convoluted command structure, the 21st was perfectly positioned to be the hammer blow. They possessed over 100 Mark IV tanks, heavily armed panzer grenadier regiments mounted in half-tracks, and formidable self-propelled artillery. This was exactly the kind of concentrated combat power that Allied planners lost sleep over. If you wanted to throw an amphibious landing back into the sea before it could take root, this was the specific instrument you used to do it. And on that pivotal morning, the British forces landing at Sword Beach were offering them an absolutely perfect target. We often picture D-Day as a steady, unstoppable wave of Allied momentum pushing relentlessly inland. But the physical reality on the ground during those first critical hours was a logistical nightmare. As the British infantry fought their way off the sand and under the seawall, they immediately hit a severe bottleneck. The narrow exits from Sword Beach were heavily mined, blocked by concrete obstacles, and choked with the burning wreckage of specialized clearing vehicles. Behind this stalled vanguard, the landing craft kept arriving on an inflexible tidal timetable, relentlessly disgorging more men, trucks, and supplies onto a rapidly shrinking strip of sand. The shoreline transformed into a chaotic parking lot of soft-skinned vehicles and trapped infantry, with nowhere to go and no room to maneuver. The danger, however, was not confined to the congestion on Sword Beach itself. A few miles to the west, the Canadian forces were fighting their own brutal battle to secure Juno Beach. The Grand Allied operational plan dictated that these two forces should rapidly drive inland, link up their flanks, and seal the front line to present a united wall against any counterattack. But warfare rarely survives contact with reality. Heavy resistance and the sheer friction of the landing meant that as the morning wore on, a dangerous, glaring gap remained open between the British and Canadian sectors. There was no continuous defensive line. There was only a wide, unprotected corridor of Norman countryside leading straight down to the sea, pointing directly at the exposed flanks of the Allied beachheads. For the German defenders, this was the absolute ideal tactical scenario. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the defense of northern France, had built his entire strategy around this precise, fleeting window of opportunity. He knew with mathematical certainty that Germany could not win a protracted war of attrition against the overwhelming industrial might of Britain and the United States once they established a secure port. His doctrine was ironclad and brutally simple. The invasion must be destroyed at the water's edge, within the first 24 hours, while the enemy was still disorganized and before they could bring their heavy armor ashore in significant numbers. The 21st Panzer Division was the local executioner designed for this exact doctrine. If they fired up their engines at dawn, formed their mechanized combat groups, and drove hard straight down that unprotected corridor between Sword and Juno, the physics of the battlefield would be entirely in their favor. They would not be fighting entrenched anti-tank guns or squaring off against heavily armored British Sherman tanks. They would be driving their Mark IVs into the exposed flanks of disorganized infantry and vulnerable supply columns. A concentrated armored punch slicing through that gap could have rolled up the British positions from the side, physically isolated the beachheads from one another, and turned the logistical traffic jams on the sand into a horrific slaughterhouse. The clock was ticking relentlessly. Every single minute that passed allowed the British to clear the beach exits and consolidate their forces. The Allies were in their most fragile state, balancing on the edge of a knife. The door was wide open for a catastrophic German counterattack. Yet, as the sun rose over Normandy and the terrifying scale of the Allied armada became undeniable, the mighty engines of the 21st Panzer Division remained largely silent. The tanks were fueled. The crews were sitting at their stations under camouflage netting, listening to the distant thunder of naval bombardment, and the field commanders were desperately waiting for the green light. But the devastating, unified strike down to the beaches never materialized. Instead of a swift, decisive armored thrust, the German response was entirely paralyzed by a rigid, heavily fractured command structure. The commander of the 21st Panzer, Lieutenant General Edgar Feutinger, was technically positioned to strike, but he was chained to a desk by protocol. His division was considered a vital strategic reserve. In the deeply paranoid hierarchy of the Third Reich, releasing such an asset required direct authorization that simply was not coming. The High Command in Paris, and ultimately Adolf Hitler at Berchtesgaden, were convinced that the Normandy landings might just be an elaborate diversion for a larger attack at the Pas de Calais. They hesitated, hoarding their armored reserves, terrified of committing their best units to the wrong sector. Feutinger was left in the dark, restricted to deploying only localized, inadequate infantry detachments, while his main armored fist sat idle, burning the single most valuable resource of the entire war: time. The precious hours slipped away. 6 o'clock passed, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. The critical morning that should have seen a massive, coordinated wave of German steel crashing into the vulnerable flanks of Sword Beach was instead squandered in an agonizing bureaucratic wait. The British were slowly, painstakingly untangling their traffic jams. They were finally pushing their own tanks and anti-tank guns off the sand and into the villages. The window of absolute vulnerability was beginning to close. When Feutinger finally received the authorization to move his heavy forces and launch a concerted counterattack, the tactical situation had already fundamentally changed. But more importantly, the orders he was given did not direct his formidable division to aggressively exploit the gaping hole between the British and the Canadians. They did not order him to crush the exposed landing forces on the sand. Instead, the German command structure had become entirely fixated on a completely different threat. While the 21st Panzer had the immediate power to sever the Allied invasion at the beaches, their attention was violently pulled in the opposite direction. Frantic, disjointed reports were flooding into the German headquarters from the dark, flooded countryside to the east of the Orne River. Something had happened in the middle of the night, a sudden, highly localized crisis that had deeply rattled the regional commanders and fundamentally altered their perception of the battlefield geometry. The entire immense operational potential of the 21st Panzer Division was about to be turned away from the vulnerable beaches and thrown at a completely unexpected problem. The German command was taking their eyes off the main amphibious invasion to deal with a shadow operating in their own rear. What exactly was this sudden crisis that distracted the German command at the worst possible moment, effectively saving the Allied landing from a unified, catastrophic armored assault? That crisis was triggered in the dead of night, hours before the first amphibious landing craft even touched the sand, by Major John Howard and a specialized force of just 181 British glider infantrymen. Dropping silently out of the dark Normandy sky, they had executed a textbook assault, overwhelming the local German garrisons to seize two vital crossings over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. The capture of what would soon become world famous as Pegasus Bridge is rightfully celebrated as one of the most daring and flawlessly executed raids in military history. But the popular retelling of this event often deeply misunderstands its true strategic weight. The enduring myth suggests a Hollywood-style standoff, where a handful of lightly armed airborne troops stood bravely behind a barricade and physically held back the entire mechanical might of a German armored division through sheer firepower and grit. The physical reality of the battlefield dictates otherwise. 181 men, armed primarily with rifles, submachine guns, and a handful of light anti-tank weapons, cannot physically stop a concentrated assault by over 100 Mark IV tanks and thousands of mechanized Panzer Grenadiers. Had the full weight of a coordinated armored division been hurled directly down that single road, the British defenders would have been overwhelmed and crushed in a matter of minutes. Howard's true achievement on the morning of June 6th was not about building an impenetrable physical wall against German steel. His weapon was far more devastating. He fundamentally manipulated the entire battlefield geometry in the minds of the enemy command. By successfully securing those bridges and carving out a firm airborne foothold on the eastern flank of the invasion zone, this tiny force of glider troops threw a massive wrench into the German situational awareness. When frantic, fragmented reports of gliders and paratroopers landing east of the Orne began flooding into German headquarters during the pre-dawn hours, the regional commanders could not see the localized reality on the ground. Through the blinding fog of war, severed communication lines, and panicked radio transmissions in the dark, this did not look like a surgical strike by a single reinforced company. To the German generals staring at their situation maps, it looked like a massive, deeply threatening airborne invasion aimed squarely at their vulnerable rear echelons. This airborne bridgehead felt like a dagger pointed directly at the eastern flank of the German defensive line. It triggered an immediate institutional paranoia. The German command structure, already notoriously rigid and struggling to comprehend the staggering scale of the amphibious armada off the coast, became entirely fixated on this eastern menace. They perceived the Orne River crossings not as a minor nuisance, but as a critical emergency that demanded a swift and overwhelming response before the British paratroopers could break out into the open country. This represents one of the most stunning paradoxes of the early hours of D-Day. As hundreds of Allied ships bombarded the coast and thousands of infantrymen desperately fought their way onto the beaches, the true existential threat to the German army, the immediate tactical focus of the regional commanders, was violently wrenched to the east. The sheer audacity and suddenness of Howard's raid forced the German high command to fracture their attention at the exact moment they desperately needed absolute, unified focus to crush the beachheads. A mere 181 British soldiers had effectively hijacked the perception of an entire enemy army. They did not stop a Panzer Division with a roadblock. They stopped it by scrambling the German tactical resolve and forcing them to react to a localized threat that felt far larger than it actually was. But how exactly did this airborne panic physically dismantle the impending German armored counterstroke? And how did it systematically rob the defenders of the one resource they could never get back? To understand the sheer scale of the tactical disaster that unfolded for the German army on the morning of June 6th, you have to stand on the eastern bank of the Orne River as the sun begins to burn off the coastal mist. Here, the immediate reality of the battlefield felt entirely different than the panicked reports flooding into headquarters. For the hardened veterans of the 21st Panzer Division, this did not look like an unstoppable Allied juggernaut. It looked like an impending German victory. Elements of the division, spearheaded by the heavily armed Panzer Grenadiers of Colonel Hermann von Luck and the Steel Corps of Panzer Regiment 22 under Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, had spent the early morning hours maneuvering into position. Their objective was clear, highly localized, and mathematically entirely in their favor: eradicate the British airborne pocket holding the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. From the hatch of a Panzer IV, the tactical geometry was simple and reassuring. The German commanders were looking at a lightly armed force of airborne infantry that had dropped in the night. The British paratroopers had no heavy armor, limited anti-tank weaponry, and were pinned against the waterways. The German tank crews, many of whom had survived the brutal mechanized meat grinders of the Eastern Front and the deserts of North Africa, knew exactly how to execute this kind of operation. You mass the armor, you coordinate the self-propelled artillery, and you drive a steel wedge straight through the unsupported infantry. The engines of over 100 Mark IV tanks idled, throwing thick blue exhaust into the damp morning air. The ammunition racks were fully loaded with high explosive shells designed to shatter infantry positions. The commanders were checking their maps, identifying the approach routes, and waiting for the final coordinates to unleash a devastating, concentrated assault that would wipe the British 6th Airborne Division off the map and secure the entire eastern flank of the Normandy region. Confidence in the assembly areas was absolute. They had the numbers, they had the heavy armor, and they had the enemy neatly boxed in. But modern warfare is rarely decided by the commanders looking through the gun sights on the front line. It is decided miles away, in quiet rooms with large maps, by men trying to interpret a fundamentally chaotic reality. Miles to the southwest, in the subterranean bunkers of the 84th Corps headquarters in Saint-Lô, the commander, General der Artillerie Erich Marx, was staring at a rapidly evolving, catastrophic picture of the entire Normandy coast. Marx was one of the few high-ranking German officers who had accurately predicted that the Allies would strike Normandy rather than the Pas de Calais, and his sharp, analytical mind was quickly cutting through the fog of war. As the morning reports solidified, the terrifying scale of the amphibious armada became undeniable. The localized airborne landings to the east, which had so thoroughly panicked the regional commanders in the middle of the night, were suddenly revealed for what they truly were: a strategic blocking force. The real, existential threat to the Third Reich was not the lightly armed paratroopers holding a couple of bridges. The true threat was the tens of thousands of British and Canadian soldiers currently fighting their way off Sword, Juno, and Gold Beaches, backed by the largest naval bombardment in human history. Marx looked at the map and saw the glaring, unprotected corridor of terrain leading straight from the coast down to the vital city of Caen. He recognized instantly that if the British amphibious forces were allowed to push their heavy armor off Sword Beach and secure that corridor, they would capture Caen, break out into the open tank country of central France, and tear the entire German defensive strategy to shreds. And then he looked at the disposition of his own forces. The 21st Panzer Division, the only mechanized hammer capable of striking the vulnerable amphibious landings and plunging into that unprotected corridor, was sitting on the wrong side of the river. They were revving their engines, preparing to swat a fly on the eastern flank, while a tiger was breaking through the front door to the north. It was mid-morning. The German tank commanders east of the Orne were making their final checks, waiting for the flare that would signal the advance. Instead, a radio operator handed over a frantic, high-priority transmission that defied all local tactical logic. The order had cascaded down from General Marx, through the Paralyzed divisional command of Edgar Feuchtinger, directly to the regimental commanders on the ground. The directive was absolute and shocking. Abort the attack on the airborne bridgehead immediately. Disengage all armored units. You are to turn the entire division around, cross back over to the western bank of the Orne River, drive north through the city of Caen, and launch a massive counterattack against the British amphibious forces advancing from the coast. For the veteran commanders sitting in the turrets of their Panzer IVs, the order was incomprehensible. They had a vulnerable, surrounded enemy right in their sights. The artillery was dialed in. The infantry was ready to dismount. To abandon a prepared attack at the absolute last second goes against the fundamental operational DNA of a mechanized officer. It means voluntarily surrendering the initiative, relinquishing a guaranteed local victory, and drastically altering the battle plan on the fly. But in the rigid top-down hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, an order was an order. The confidence that had permeated the German assembly areas instantly evaporated, replaced by intense, furious frustration. The commanders grabbed their radio microphones and began barking the hardest command any armored officer can give: stop, pack it up, and turn around. The psychological whiplash of this sudden reversal was immense, but it was nothing compared to the physical nightmare of actually executing it. Reversing the operational direction of a fully equipped Panzer Division is not simply a matter of turning steering wheels. A mechanized division is a colossal, lumbering beast of logistics. It consists of over 100 heavy tanks, hundreds of half-tracks, self-propelled artillery pieces, anti-aircraft batteries, fuel bowsers, ammunition trucks, and thousands of men. This massive column of steel and machinery now had to untangle itself from its assault formations, form back into march columns, and navigate westward. And they could not simply drive across the open Norman fields in a straight line toward their new objective. To get from the eastern bank of the Orne River to the vital ground north of Caen, they had to cross the waterways. And to cross the waterways, they had to funnel the entire mechanized might of the division directly through the city of Caen itself. Caen was not a wide-open highway. It was an ancient, dense, medieval city characterized by narrow, winding streets and tight intersections. But on the late morning of June 6th, it was something far worse. Throughout the night and the early morning, Allied heavy bombers had systematically pounded the city infrastructure, attempting to sever the exact logistical arteries the Germans were now trying to use. As the vanguard of the 21st Panzer Division approached the city limits, they did not find roads. They found an apocalyptic landscape of shattered masonry, collapsed timber, and deep cratering. The sky above the city was choked with thick, black smoke pouring from burning buildings, blotting out the midday sun. When the leading Mark IV tanks, measuring nearly 10 feet wide, attempted to push into the narrow urban corridors, the intricate choreography of a mechanized maneuver instantly collapsed into a chaotic, crawling traffic jam. The sheer friction of war took absolute control. Tank tracks ground agonizingly against massive piles of rubble, tearing up the pavement and throwing sparks into the dust-choked air. Drivers, operating with limited visibility through narrow, armored slits, were completely blinded by the swirling smoke and the pulverized mortar dust kicked up by the vehicles ahead. To prevent the massive machines from crashing into the debris or each other, tank commanders were forced to open their top hatches, exposing their torsos to the choking heat, falling masonry, and the constant threat of Allied fighter bombers, just to physically guide their drivers forward by shouting over the deafening roar of Maybach engines operating at maximum stress. The city had become a suffocating bottleneck. The single, unified armored fist of the 21st Panzer Division was forced to string itself out into a thin, agonizingly slow-moving line. Formations were broken apart. Regiments became separated from their supply columns. Radio communication, already strained, became fragmented and unreliable as the radio waves struggled to penetrate the dense, burning urban environment and the metallic chaos of the traffic jam. Vehicles that suffered mechanical breakdowns or overheated engines in the intense heat of the fires could not be easily pushed aside. They became solid steel roadblocks, forcing the entire column behind them to halt while recovery vehicles desperately tried to clear the path. Thousands of terrified French civilians, fleeing the heavy bombardment and carrying whatever possessions they could hold, were caught in the crossfire of the ruined streets, further clogging the intersections and forcing the heavy tanks to navigate with agonizing, creeping caution. Finding the remaining intact bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal became a desperate logistical puzzle. The division had to squeeze its massive tonnage over these narrow choke points, one vehicle at a time. The heat inside the buttoned-up tanks became unbearable. The air filters choked on the dust. The frustration of the German crews reached a boiling point. They were elite frontline soldiers, equipped with some of the deadliest machines on the battlefield, yet they were entirely neutralized, trapped in a crawling, burning labyrinth of their own territory, fighting a grueling battle against architecture and rubble while the actual enemy was miles away. As the tanks inched forward, the clock continued its relentless, unforgiving ticking. 10 o'clock in the morning bled into 11. 11 o'clock stretched into noon. Noon dragged agonizingly into 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Every single minute that the 21st Panzer Division spent wrestling with the rubble of Caen, violently shifting gears, and cursing the contradictory orders of their high command, was a minute that belonged entirely to the British. Because while the German armored spearhead was effectively paralyzed in urban traffic, the physical reality on the Normandy coast was undergoing a massive, high-speed transformation. Cross-cut the battlefield and look at Sword Beach during these exact 3.5 hours of German delay. The chaotic, vulnerable parking lot of the early morning, the very nightmare scenario of disorganized infantry pinned against the seawall, was systematically being dismantled. The British logistical machinery, the very industrial might that Erwin Rommel had feared, was rapidly grinding into high gear. The specialized armored vehicles of the 79th Armored Division, the flail tanks that beat the sand with heavy chains to detonate mines, the armored bulldozers pushing aside concrete obstacles, the The bridge-laying tanks, dropping spans over anti-tank ditches, had finally succeeded in forcing multiple safe exits off the shoreline. The suffocating bottleneck at the water's edge was untangling, and crucially, the heavy armor that the Allies desperately needed to survive a counterattack was now rolling steadily off the landing craft and onto French soil. The amphibious, waterproofed Sherman tanks of the Staffordshire Yeomanry, the 13th/18th Royal Hussars, and the East Riding Yeomanry were shaking off the salt water and gunning their engines inland. The British forces were not simply wandering into the Norman countryside. They were executing a highly coordinated, pre-planned defensive doctrine. They knew that a German armored counterattack was the single greatest threat to their survival, and they knew exactly where it would likely come from. As the British infantry battalions pushed south, they made a beeline for the vital high ground, specifically the Perrier's Ridge, a subtle but commanding elevation that directly overlooked the primary roads leading out of the northern outskirts of Caen. This was the exact geographical corridor the 21st Panzer Division would be forced to use once they finally escaped the city. With frantic, desperate energy, the British were building a wall. Infantrymen dug deep slit trenches into the chalky soil, transforming the ridgeline into a fortified perimeter. The Royal Artillery rushed their dedicated anti-tank batteries forward. They unhitched the agile, highly accurate 6-pounder anti-tank guns and hauled them into camouflage positions within the hedgerows and tree lines. Even more critically, they deployed the massive, cumbersome, but devastatingly powerful 17-pounder anti-tank guns. These heavy weapons, capable of punching through the thick frontal armor of a Panzer IV at long range, were dug deeply into the Norman earth, their long barrels carefully sighted straight down the roads leading back to Caen. Simultaneously, the British Sherman tanks were maneuvering into hull-down positions behind the crests of the hills. By hiding the vulnerable lower hulls of their tanks behind the dirt and exposing only the heavily armored turrets and main guns, they transformed their vehicles into highly lethal, protected pillboxes. They dialed in the ranges to the tree lines and intersections to the south, preparing overlapping fields of fire that would create a solid wall of high-velocity, armor-piercing shells. The entire nature of the battlefield inverted during those lost hours. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the 21st Panzer Division could have driven into the exposed flanks of disorganized infantry battalions, struggling to move supplies off a chaotic beach. They could have shattered the fragile beachhead through sheer shock and momentum. But by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the situation had fundamentally and irreversibly changed. The British had utilized the gift of time to transform a vulnerable, disorganized landing zone into a deeply entrenched, layered, steel-reinforced front line. The window of absolute vulnerability, the fleeting opportunity upon which the entire German defensive strategy of the Atlantic Wall had been staked, was systematically and violently welded shut. It was pushing toward mid-afternoon when the vanguard of the 21st Panzer Division finally began to break free from the suffocating, smoke-filled ruins of Caen. Covered in white masonry dust, their engines running hot, and the crews exhausted from the sheer physical toll of navigating the urban wreckage, the armored columns began to reassemble on the northern outskirts of the city, near the dominating heights of Lebesay Wood. Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, commanding the Panzer Regiment, pushed himself up out of his turret, raised his heavy Zeiss binoculars, and looked toward the coast. What he saw was the absolute death of German operational momentum. The gentle, rolling slopes leading down toward the English Channel were no longer empty, inviting avenues of attack. Through the magnified lenses, the German commanders could see the distinct, terrifying silhouettes of British Sherman tanks, perfectly positioned hull down along the ridges. They could spot the freshly turned earth of anti-tank positions dug into the tree lines. They could see the steady, uninterrupted flow of Allied reinforcements moving inland from the beaches, completely unmolested. And above it all, the sky was thick with the unmistakable profiles of Allied fighter bombers, Hawker Typhoons and Supermarine Spitfires, circling like predatory birds, holding absolute air supremacy and waiting to pounce with rockets and cannons the moment the German armor moved out into the open ground. The bitter, devastating realization washed over the German command. The 3.5 hours they had spent wrestling with contradictory orders, reversing their division, and fighting their way through the rubble of their own city had cost them the single most important asset in armored warfare, the element of surprise. They were no longer executing a rapid, overwhelming counterthrust into a soft, vulnerable flank. Because of the institutional paralysis and the time lost to the friction of war, they were now being asked to launch a direct, frontal assault against a prepared, entrenched, and heavily armed enemy holding the high ground. The unified, crushing blow that could have physically shattered the invasion on the sand had been diluted by delay into a desperate, uphill battle against an enemy that was growing stronger by the minute. The clock had run out, the trap had been set, and the 21st Panzer Division was staring directly into the teeth of a steel wall. So, with the element of surprise completely dead, the tactical advantage surrendered to the enemy, and 3.5 irreplaceable hours forever lost in the rubble of Caen. What exactly happened when this delayed, deeply frustrated armored column finally pushed the throttles forward and violently collided with the entrenched Allied beachhead? When the German tanks finally rolled forward late that afternoon, the result was exactly as devastating as the British had planned. The main armored fist of the 21st Panzer Division advanced directly into the interlocking fire zones of Paralyzed Ridge. As the Mark IVs crested the slight inclines, they were met by a solid wall of high-velocity, armor-piercing shells. British 17-pounder anti-tank guns hidden deep in the hedgerows, and Sherman Fireflies, firing from protected hull-down positions, dismantled the advancing formations with mechanical precision. Within minutes, the unified counterattack that was supposed to sweep the British into the sea was completely shattered. Burning tanks threw thick columns of oily black smoke into the sky, marking the sudden death of the primary German effort. But the battlefield of Normandy was not a tidy, continuous line. It was a chaotic environment full of blind spots and unpredictable friction. As the main armored corps was being systematically broken on the ridge, a separate, smaller combat group operating on the far left flank experienced a completely different reality. A vanguard of Panzer Grenadiers from the 192nd Regiment, supported by a handful of surviving Mark IV tanks, had peeled away from the heavy fighting. Maneuvering northwest through the dense Norman countryside, they expected at any moment to collide with the same impenetrable wall of British steel. Instead, they found nothing. Stumbling through the farmland, this localized combat group had accidentally threaded the needle. They had slipped directly into the exact geographical seam between the British forces expanding outward from Sword Beach and the Canadian forces pushing aggressively inland from Juno Beach. Because of the heavy resistance both Allied forces had faced upon landing, their inner flanks had not yet linked up. The Panzer Grenadiers were suddenly driving down a completely undefended, 3-mile-wide corridor. Sensing the vacuum, the German group pressed the accelerator. They bypassed isolated pockets of resistance, ignoring their own vulnerable flanks, and pushed relentlessly north. They drove right through the heart of the Allied beachhead, entirely unmolested by anti-tank guns or heavy armor. By 8 o'clock that evening, they achieved the impossible. The lead half-tracks and tanks rolled into the coastal town of Lion-sur-Mer, their treads grinding to a halt just short of the sand. The German soldiers dismounted and looked out over the English Channel. Before them lay the unimaginable scale of the Allied armada, thousands of ships stretching to the horizon. Against all odds, despite the catastrophic delays and the destruction of their main force, this small vanguard had successfully sliced the invasion in half. They were the only German unit to reach the water on D-Day. But as the sun began to lower over the coast, the stark reality of their position set in. The main attack was dead miles behind them. They had reached the sea, but they were entirely alone. The question now was terrifyingly simple. What could a single, isolated battalion actually do to exploit a gap that was already closing around them? Standing on the dunes of Lion-sur-Mer, the sheer gravity of their situation pressed down on the commanders of this German vanguard. They had driven a wedge between the British and the Canadians, but a wedge requires a sledgehammer to drive it home. There was no sledgehammer. The heavy armor of the 21st Panzer Division was miles to the south, burning in front of Paralyzed Ridge. This small combat group of Panzer Grenadiers and a handful of Mark IV tanks was now stretched terrifyingly thin, occupying a narrow corridor pointing directly into the teeth of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. To exploit a breakthrough of this magnitude, you need immediate reinforcements and clear communication. They had neither. Frantic attempts to raise divisional headquarters on the radios were met with static or panic chatter. Looking east toward Sword Beach and west toward Juno, the infantrymen could hear the relentless grinding of Allied tank treads and the deafening roar of naval artillery tearing apart the countryside. The gap they had slipped through was not a static open door. It was a tightening vice. The British and Canadians were aggressively expanding their beachheads, and it was only a matter of time before the two immense forces linked up, slamming the door shut right behind them. The psychological pressure of this isolation was already pushing the German officers to the breaking point. Then, shortly before 9 o'clock in the evening, the sky itself seemed to tear open. A droning hum from the English Channel rapidly built into an earth-shaking roar. The soldiers on the coast looked up into the fading light and witnessed a terrifying spectacle. Sweeping directly over their heads, barely above the rooftops, was a colossal Allied air armada. Hundreds of heavy transport planes, towing massive gliders, darkened the sky in an endless stream. This was the second major wave of the British 6th Airborne Division, bringing crucial reinforcements to solidify the eastern flank. To the isolated vanguard pinned against the sea, however, this did not look like a routine reinforcement drop. It looked like a perfectly timed death trap. As they watched the gliders bank sharply and begin their descent into the fields to the south, the terrifying illusion was absolute. The commanders believed the Allies were intentionally dropping a massive airborne wall directly behind them to cut off their only avenue of escape. The fear of being entirely surrounded and annihilated within this narrow corridor completely overwhelmed their tactical discipline. The nerve of the local commanders suddenly and violently snapped. Without waiting for authorization from a headquarters they could no longer reach, without firing a single decisive shot into the exposed flanks of the Allied beaches, the order was given: retreat. The Panzer Grenadiers scrambled into their half-tracks. The Mark IV tanks violently threw their gears into reverse. They abandoned the dunes, turned their backs on the unimaginable target of the invasion fleet, and desperately raced south, frantically trying to escape the corridor before the perceived airborne noose could tighten. The only German unit to reach the water on D-Day voluntarily surrendered the greatest tactical opportunity of the entire battle, driven away by the overwhelming psychological shock of an airborne shadow. By nightfall, the gap between Sword and Juno Beaches was firmly in Allied hands. The German wedge had simply vanished. But what is the true historical meaning of this desperate, failed maneuver? The failure of that isolated German vanguard at Lion-sur-Mer was not a failure of local tactics. They did not lose because they were outgunned on the sand, or because an impenetrable wall of Allied tanks physically blocked their path. They failed because by the time their treads touched the shoreline, they were merely a fractured, exhausted fragment of a division that had spent the entire day fighting its own high command. This reality brings us full circle to the dark, early hours of June 6th, and the profound, deeply misunderstood legacy of Major John Howard and his 181 glider infantrymen. For decades, the capture of Pegasus Bridge has been celebrated as a masterpiece of small unit tactics, a story of brave men holding a vital choke point against impossible odds. But examining the broader operational canvas of D-Day reveals a far more devastating achievement. Howard's troops did not defeat the 21st Panzer Division in direct combat. They did not place a physical barricade in front of over 100 Mark IV tanks and manually stop them from driving to the sea. Their ultimate victory was far more insidious. They completely destroyed the enemy's timetable. By dropping out of the night sky and securing a foothold on the eastern flank, those few British soldiers engineered a massive operational disruption. They hijacked the situational awareness of a notoriously rigid German command structure, forcing regional generals to treat a highly localized raid as a catastrophic threat to their rear echelons. That single, brilliant diversion scrambled the German tactical resolve. It forced the only mechanized force capable of shattering the Allied beachhead to abort its initial staging, reverse its heavy columns, and burn 3.5 irreplaceable hours, grinding through the suffocating rubble of Caen. Because of that manufactured delay, what should have been a devastating unified armored thrust screaming down an undefended corridor at 10 in the morning was diluted into a series of late, disjointed maneuvers against a fortified steel wall in the late afternoon. The true battle for the Normandy coast was not just fought over strips of sand. It was an unforgiving war fought over time and coordination. Germany lost its single greatest opportunity to repel the invasion, not because its heavy tanks were positioned too far away. They lost because institutional confusion, paranoid leadership, and 181 British paratroopers systematically robbed them of the speed required to exploit their own breakthrough. The German army actually did achieve the impossible on the evening of D-Day by slipping through the chaotic battlefield, severing the fragile gap between two invading armies, and physically reaching the waters of the English Channel. But modern mechanized warfare is a ruthless equation where time is the ultimate currency. And because of a handful of British airborne troops holding a bridge in the dark, alongside 3 irreplaceable hours burned in the smoking rubble of their own city, that historic breakthrough was entirely hollowed out. By the time those forward units finally stood on the dunes at Lion-sur-Mer, their heavy armor was shattered, the strategic window had violently slammed shut, and their monumental counterattack was reduced to nothing more than a fleeting, meaningless glimpse of the ocean.